The pursuit of true happiness, and why most people never get there. The practice of the Buddha's teaching can be called the serious pursuit of true happiness, with the emphasis on the serious and the true. Serious not in the sense of grim, but in the sense of sincere, unwilling to settle for anything less than genuine. True here means a happiness that doesn't change, a happiness that doesn't let you down. This is why so many of the Buddha's teachings focus on suffering, because most of the happiness, or the things that we take for happiness in daily life, really do end up causing suffering as they change. So many times the happiness we gain turns into something else. And of the happiness that turns into pain, the Buddha asked, "Is it a noble thing to search for that kind of happiness? Is it a wise, skillful thing to search for that kind of happiness as an end in and of itself? If you know it's going to let you down at some point, why put so much effort into it?" That's the question he asked himself. That's the question that led him to go off into the wilderness to find if there was a true happiness that could be gained through human effort. The pursuit of true happiness. This is why we regularly chant the chant on aging, illness, death, and separation. These 4 reflections are what led the Buddha to go out into the wilderness. They gave him a feeling of samvega, a sense of dismay over the way of ordinary life, the pointlessness of so many things that we do. Samvega also implies a sense of urgency in wanting to find a way out. If his reflections had stopped right there, though, they would have been very depressing. But there's also the 5th reflection that gave the Buddha the encouragement to go, that gave rise to a sense of pasada, or confidence. Whatever we do for good or for evil to, that will we fall heir. Is there a skillful way of action, he asked himself, that could lead beyond this constant wandering on, this constant gaining and losing, coming together and falling apart, that's so typical of our ordinary lives? After the course of 6 years of earnest experimenting, he found that, yes, there is a way. That way was what he taught for the rest of his life. The one message that was so important that it was worth giving his whole life to, that the search for true happiness is not a futile search. He noticed that when we run up against suffering, when we run up against all the problems of our lives, there are 2 reactions. One is a sense of bewilderment. Why is this happening? Often, why is this happening to me? And then there's a search. Is there someone who knows a way out? And because they go together, the bewilderment and the search, oftentimes we look in the wrong places because we're confused about what happiness is, what suffering is. So when he taught the 4 noble truths, he said, with regard to the first truth, this is the task you want to accomplish, to comprehend suffering, to understand what's creating such a burden on the mind. He had discovered that there are 2 kinds of suffering, the stress in the changefulness in things in life, but also the unnecessary stress and suffering we cause ourselves over those changes. That's the issue, because once that second suffering is wiped out, the changes don't impinge on the mind at all. As in Ajahn Suwat's teaching that I've repeated many times, the mountain over there on the eastern horizon, is it heavy? He would ask. And his answer would be, if you try to pick it up, yes. If you don't try to pick it up, it's not heavy for you. It may be heavy in and of itself, but if you don't pick it up, it doesn't impinge on you. It's not an issue for you. The same principle applies to suffering in general. As we sit here, what demands are being placed on you? All that's being asked is that you sit relatively still for the hour, breathe, and watch the breath, stay with the breath. When the breath comes in, know that it's coming in. When it goes out, know that it's going out. Breathe as comfortably as you can. There are several ways of working with this. Try breathing deep and long for a while, and if you notice any parts of the body that are feeling tense with a long breath, try to relax them. Or you can change the rhythm of your breathing. Experiment to see what feels good right now. So often we allow ourselves to breathe in ways that are uncomfortable, and yet nobody's forcing us to do so. It's just that we're not paying attention. We don't usually think that there's anything there to pay attention to. Yet the energy of the breath is our basic energy in life. It stands to reason that if the breath energy is good, the body will be healthier, the mind will be more at ease. It will have a better place to stay. That's all that's asked of us, and yet we manage to develop 108 problems around it. There's pain in the legs, pain in the back. We can get all worked up about the pain, even though we know that as soon as we get up and change positions, the pain will go away. It's not harmful pain. It's not going to cause your leg to fall off or get gangrene or anything like that, and yet the mind can create all kinds of scenarios, torturing itself, tormenting itself. Or you can drag in things from the past, or worries about the future. Even this much can show you how clearly you create all sorts of unnecessary torment for yourself just sitting right here. The purpose of the meditation is to find out why, how it happens, and also how you can stop doing it, how you can drop these habits of the mind that cause so much unnecessary suffering. The easiest way to see these things is to go off and be alone, to find some seclusion. The texts talk about 3 types of seclusion: physical, mental, and seclusion from your mental baggage. For physical seclusion, you come out here to the monastery and you're basically alone. You don't deal with that many people. The burdens of constant social contact are cut away quite a bit. You're not totally alone, but during the course of the day when you're out under the trees, there you are, alone. That in and of itself lightens a lot of burdens on the body. That's just physical seclusion though, because you find often that your mind isn't secluded. It's dragging in all kinds of events, past and future, to keep it company. Even when it's in the present, as the Buddha says, we live with craving as our companion. We want to feel this way, to think that way. Even if we don't want to think about these things, they come up and we grab hold of them out of habit. So the first step in gaining mental seclusion is to cut away past and future and just be with the present moment. You use the breath as your anchor. When you're with the breath, you know you're in the present and you have the tools for dealing with whatever discomfort arises there. You can breathe in ways that minimize suffering or actually become actively refreshing, satisfying, absorbing. You find with this simple act of staying with the breath, as you stay with it longer and longer, trying to keep yourself as sensitive as possible to how the breathing feels, making a little adjustment here, a little adjustment there, that a sense of ease comes without your having to think about giving rise to it apart from what you're doing with the breath. It's just there from the continuity of your focus, the sensitivity of your focus. There can even be a sense of rapture, a sense of fullness. You breathe in feeling really refreshed, breathe out feeling really refreshed. And the more you get absorbed in the present moment like this, the further away the past and the future seem to be. This is a step above simple physical seclusion because you find that once you've learned how to recognize this centered spot and how to maintain it in this secluded place, you can test whether you can maintain it in other contexts as well. Get up and walk around. Can you maintain that same sense of being centered as you're walking, doing other work around the place as you're talking with other people? This is where you see a lot of the tricks the mind plays on itself, worrying, what is that person thinking about me? How can I impress this person? Nobody here wants to be impressed, and yet everybody's trying to impress everyone else. When you learn how to drop those thoughts, how to stay centered while you're with others, you find that life is lighter both for yourself and for the people around you. You work step by step to try to maintain this same steady sense of center, whatever the context, whatever the situation, so that even when you're not in physical seclusion, the mind is secluded. It's no longer running after the future, running after the past, but it still has craving as its companion. That's the final level of seclusion, when you can get rid of your companionship with craving. The commentaries call this upadi viveka, being secluded from the mind's acquisitions or the mind's baggage, your cravings, your clingings, your conceits, your ignorance. Dig into the present moment and find out exactly what's happening here. How is it that the mind can still create suffering and stress even when you're centered in the present moment? It's very subtle. At that point, it's hard to call it suffering. It seems more like simple stress. But as you focus on what's happening, you begin to see you're doing this that's unnecessary. You're doing that's unnecessary, creating needless burdens for the mind. It's like a little child learning how to walk. When it first tries to walk, it moves not only its legs but also its arms, and sometimes its head stiffens up its neck. It gets all kinds of unnecessary muscles involved because it doesn't understand what's necessary and what's not. But as it gets more skilled at walking, more and more observant, it begins to see that it doesn't have to move its arms in that way, doesn't have to stiffen up its head in that way. It can begin to relax different parts of the body until walking is not such a major effort. How true is true happiness? The same with the meditation. As we center the mind, we realize after a while that we're doing all kinds of unnecessary things to keep it centered. To keep the mind strapped down in the present moment, we sometimes force it too much, sometimes thinking that we have to pull the breath here, or pull the breath there, or force the mind here, or tense this here, or tense that there. When you begin to realize that these things aren't necessary, you begin to let go. As you let go of those activities, the act of centering the mind becomes more natural. You're more at ease in the present moment, and you get clearer and clearer about what you're doing. It's through peeling these layers away that you get to a point where ultimately you can let go of that companion here in the present moment, so that the mind is truly secluded. At that point, it goes beyond even time and space. It touches another dimension. That's when you learn what it's like to be truly free of the stress and suffering you create for yourself. That's when you have your first taste of what it's like to find true happiness, true ease, true well-being. So the practice takes you step by step from all your entanglements and all this unnecessary suffering you cause yourself, peels them away, strips them away, layer by layer by layer, until you find that what the Buddha taught was true. Yes, through your own efforts you can come to the spot where the mind opens up to this other dimension that he calls deathless, free from aging, free from illness, free from death, free from separation. So even though the Buddha may often talk about stress and suffering, it's his first noble truth. It's the starting point for all four noble truths. These truths are aiming in the direction of true happiness. The four noble truths are there to test anything that's false, like the touchstones they used in the past to test for true gold. You hold on to your stone to test everything that comes your way because you want the gold. Once you've got the gold, though, you can put the stone aside. So this is what we're here for. We have that chant. May I be happy, may I be free from stress and pain. We chant that every night before the meditation to remind ourselves of why we're here, for true happiness. And it reminds us to look at all the things we do throughout the day that get in the way of that wish. It's our most sincere wishes, and yet we're always doing things to block it, to get in its way. So try to keep this in mind. Keep checking. What are you doing that's getting in the way of true happiness? What are the unnecessary things you feel you just can't do without, that are a built-in part of your personality? They don't have to be. They may have deep roots, but they can be uprooted, these habits we have. We're working on the skills right now that can uproot them until we reach the point where we're not causing ourselves or the people around us any unnecessary stress or pain. It may sound simple. It may even sound small-minded and small-hearted for a spiritual goal, but if you actually follow the process, you see that it takes you beyond what you might have imagined. How true is true happiness? Well, Follow the process, be sensitive, be observant, be ingenious in the practice, and you'll find out. So many people misunderstand the Buddha's attitude toward happiness and suffering. A couple of years back, I got a phone call from a friend who had attended a Dhamma talk where the teacher had said that life is suffering is the second noble truth. The friend called up to scoff at the teacher, saying that, of course, everyone knows that that's not the second noble truth, that's the first noble truth. And I had to tell him that it wasn't any noble truth. The Buddha never said that life is suffering. He said there is suffering in life. That was his first noble truth, and he identified what that suffering is. But he went on to say that there is a cause for suffering that you can abandon, and there is a path to the end of suffering that you can develop so that you can reach the end of suffering, all of which can be found in life. So life isn't just suffering. It's important to underline that point because so many people misunderstand the Buddha's attitude toward happiness and suffering. Just this last weekend, I heard someone saying that the Buddha's basic teachings are that all things are inconstant and all things are suffering. That's not the case either. As the Buddha once said, if there were no pleasure in the five aggregates, we wouldn't be attached to them. They do offer pleasure, and we need to understand the different kinds of pleasure they offer so we can use that pleasure as a means to the highest happiness or the highest pleasure, Nibbana. The Pali word for pleasure and happiness is sukha. It's one of the Buddha's most basic terms, and as is so often the case with the most central terms in the Buddha's teachings, he doesn't define it. Sukha can be translated as bliss, pleasure, ease, well-being, or happiness. What the Buddha does describe in detail are the different levels of sukha and the different ways that sukha functions. In other words, he describes what's practical to know about sukha so that you can know which kinds of sukha to pursue and which to avoid. I think one of the reasons he doesn't define sukha is because as you practice, your sense of what counts as happiness is going to develop and get more refined. So it's important that your idea of happiness doesn't get nailed down too tightly when you're starting out. The Buddha's own search was a search for true happiness, a happiness that doesn't age, grow ill, or die. That's what he was looking for. After having spent years indulging in the intense sensual pleasures of the palace, he did what so many people do when they have been indulging in sensual pleasure that way. He went to the other extreme and practiced austerities. In his case, for 6 years. He denied himself food, forced himself not to breathe, and grew very emaciated because he was afraid of pleasure. One of the most important insights of that period, though, was that denying yourself any kind of pleasure at all is not the way. It doesn't lead to liberation. So then the question arose in his mind, is there another way? And he thought of the time when he was a child sitting under a tree and had entered the first jhana, rapture and pleasure born of seclusion, accompanied by directed thought and evaluation. Recollecting that, he had an instinctive sense that that would be the path. But then he asked himself, why am I afraid of that pleasure? And he realized it was nothing to be afraid of. It wasn't intoxicating. It didn't cause any harm to anyone. Those are the two defining aspects of any pleasure that's unskillful. It's harmful and it's intoxicating. We see so many pleasures in life that involve oppressing other people. The people enjoying those pleasures may not be conscious of the fact that they're causing oppression or hardship. To whatever extent they do notice, they'll often close their minds to it and deny that it's causing anybody any harm. Or if it is causing somebody harm, it's causing harm to people or beings who don't matter. That attitude is one of the things that makes that pleasure unskillful. Not only does it harm other people, but it also fosters unskillful qualities of indifference and lack of shame. Intoxicating pleasure is the kind that dulls the mind so you can't really see what you're doing. The most obvious examples of this sort of pleasure are those that come from alcohol and drugs, but there are other intoxicating pleasures as well. Anything that excites a very strong addiction, that dulls the mind, dulls your perceptions, that's a kind of pleasure to be avoided. The pleasure of jhana, though, is neither harmful nor intoxicating. Sometimes modern Dhamma teachers will warn you about the dangers of getting attached to the pleasures of jhana, that somehow they're a major peril to be avoided and feared, but the Buddha never talked in those terms. Quite the contrary. He said that if you don't have the pleasure of jhana or something better than that, you won't be able to let go of your attachments to sensual pleasures. To let go of a lower-level pleasure, you need something higher to hold on to, something to substitute for it. Otherwise, you go sneaking back to your old ways, denying the fact that you're doing that. Or you grow attached to your pride that you're so strong, so resilient, and so tough in the practice that you don't need pleasure. But then that pride becomes a major obstacle to seeing where the mind is actually looking to feed. As the Buddha said, the pleasure of jhana is a necessary part of the practice. It's the kind of happiness that allows you to have a sense of well-being, a sense of nourishment along the way, and yet keeps the mind clear so that it sees what it's doing. The Buddha actually talks of jhana in terms of food. He says we feed on rapture when we meditate, and he describes jhana as a storehouse of provisions. He compares the practice as a whole to building and maintaining a fortress on a frontier. Mindfulness is the gatekeeper who knows whom to let in and whom to keep out. Discernment is the well-plastered wall that the enemy can't climb because they can't gain a foothold on the plaster. Persistence is your army of soldiers, and jhana is your storehouse of grain, honey, oil, all the food you need in order to keep the gatekeeper and the army strong. So the pleasure of jhana is a necessary part of the practice. It keeps you nourished. As for the danger of getting attached to that nourishment, I can find only one passage in the canon where the Buddha talks about the danger of jhana, and it's relatively minor. He says that once you can attain jhana and you decide you don't want to go any further, it's like holding a stick covered with sap, and your hand gets stuck to the stick because of the sap. But jhana doesn't make it impossible to get unstuck. In fact, you need the stillness of jhana to look objectively at the pleasures you've been attached to so far in your life, to see that they're no match for the pleasures of concentration. Only then are you encouraged to ask yourself, are there any drawbacks to this state of concentration? Is there something better than this? That reflection becomes a solvent that removes the sap from your hands. In any event, I don't know anyone who's killed anyone, stolen anything, or broken any of the other precepts through attachment to jhana. But you look at the way people are attached to sensual pleasures. It's the source for a lot of the cruelty, heartlessness, and thoughtlessness in the world, all the harm that people cause one another. If you're not attached to the pleasure of jhana, if you don't have that available, you're going to sneak back to the types of pleasure that can cause all kinds of harm to yourself and to others. So don't be afraid of the pleasure of jhana. Don't try to avoid it for fear that you'll get stuck. Of course, you're going to get stuck, at least for a while, but you're stuck on the kind of pleasure that allows you to clarify the mind. That way, you can begin to see what's going on, where you're stuck, and how to get unstuck. This is an important part of noble right concentration, not simply that you get into the different levels of jhana, but that the mind can then step back while you're in the jhana to examine the state of jhana while you're still within its range. The Buddha gives the analogy of a person sitting who's watching someone who's lying down, or a person standing who's watching someone sitting. In other words, you're above and behind your own state of concentration, and you can see what's going on. Or you could compare it to having your hand in a glove. When you're fully in the glove of jhana, you can't observe it. But when you pull the glove off a bit, without totally removing it from your hand, you can look around at the mind inside the glove. That way, you thoroughly comprehend how the mind relates to its object, which gives you insight into the process of fabrication. This is where fabrication becomes clearest, when you're in a state of strong concentration and you can see the movements of the mind very clearly. Ultimately, you reach the point where you decide that even the pleasure of jhana is not pleasant enough. It's not peaceful enough because of the instabilities of fabrication. You want something more peaceful, something more solid than fabrication can make. So it's not that you stop aiming at happiness and pleasure. It's just that your idea of happiness and pleasure gets more refined. This is when you can let go of the jhana, and through insight into the process of fabrication, allow the fabrication to stop. You no longer try to fabricate anything out of what you've got in the present moment. That's when the mind opens up in an unexpected way to something that's not fabricated, and the realization hits that when the Buddha said there is a deathless happiness, he knew what he was talking about. You've got your evidence right here. You see very clearly the stress that's involved even in the fabrication of a very subtle pleasure of concentration, because you've got something better, the unfabricated, to compare it to. So the Buddha is not teaching you to be a stoic with a stiff upper lip, denying yourself any pleasure or happiness. He himself was actually a connoisseur of pleasure. He wanted only the highest happiness, and he found it. As for us, he wants us to want only the highest happiness, and to practice so we can find it too. He didn't say that pleasure is bad or that numbness is good, but he did say that different levels of pleasure have different effects on the mind. You want to look at the pleasure you find in different aspects of your life to see which kinds of pleasure are harmful and intoxicating, and which ones help to clear the mind. The ones that clear the mind include not only the pleasure of concentration, but also the pleasure of generosity and the pleasure of observing the precepts. The Buddha talks about how the practice of generosity and the precepts gives rise to a sense of joy, a sense of well-being, that then becomes a basis for concentration. From there, you develop the more refined levels of pleasure that come with concentration. As the mind grows clearer and clearer, you get to the ultimate pleasure, one totally free from disturbance because it lies outside of space and time. Years back, I attended a commemoration for Ajahn Lee's passing. It was the last commemoration I attended before I returned to the States. They had invited a senior monk from Bangkok to give the concluding Dhamma talk of the commemoration, but about 15 minutes before he was scheduled to get up on the Dhamma seat, he still hadn't arrived. They got a phone call from him that he was stuck in traffic and wouldn't be able to make it in time. So they asked one of the forest ajahns to get up and give a talk instead. His talk was about how the central teaching of the Buddha was about suffering and stress. He talked for an hour about the Four Noble Truths, with his major focus on the truth of suffering, suffering, suffering. Just a few minutes after he had finished, the senior monk from Bangkok finally arrived, so they asked him to get up on the sermon seat and give a talk too. He hadn't heard what the previous talk was. He got up and he said the Buddha's central teaching was all about happiness. And both were right. The Buddha talked about suffering because he wanted us to see the suffering we tend not to see, so we can look for a higher happiness, and not just for the kind of happiness with which we tend to content ourselves. So when the Buddha talked about dukkha, suffering, or stress, he wasn't just saying that life is miserable and all you can do is accept the fact. He was saying that there is suffering, but it doesn't have to be there. There's the suffering of the three characteristics, which is inherent in fabricated things. But on top of that is the suffering in the Four Noble Truths, which is caused by craving and clinging. That kind of suffering you can put an end to. And when you put an end to it, the suffering of the three characteristics no longer weighs on the mind because you found something that lies beyond what's fabricated. So the Buddha talked about suffering for the sake of happiness, for the sake of true happiness. He was like a doctor. When you go to see the doctor and he asks you, "Okay, what's wrong? Where does it hurt?" He's not being pessimistic. He focuses on your illness because he has a cure. The Buddha described himself as a doctor. He focused on stress and suffering because he had a cure, leading to the health of true happiness. Always keep this point in mind as you practice. We're not here to run away from pleasure. We're here to see what pleasure really is and become connoisseurs of pleasure, distinguishing between which kind of pleasure, when you indulge in it, has harmful results, and which kind of pleasure, when you indulge in it, becomes part of the path, so that you can find the ultimate pleasure that doesn't require indulgence at all. It's just there. That's what we're practicing for. No happiness other than peace. Naati santi param sukham. There is no happiness other than peace. This saying of the Buddha has an interesting history. Over time, the translation turned from "there is no happiness other than peace" to "there is no happiness higher than peace," which totally changes the meaning. Perhaps people thought that there are other kinds of happiness not related to peace at all. The happiness of winning out over somebody else, the happiness of sensual desire, even the happiness that goes along with being angry. People like to be angry. There's a certain amount of pleasure with that and all the other defilements, and there's certainly no peace there. But if you look carefully, you'll see that even in the defilements there is a moment of rest, a moment of certainty, a moment of settling in, even if just for a second. And sometimes it lasts longer. After all, the Buddha did recognize that it's possible to get into very strong states of absorption based on greed, aversion, and delusion. They're wrong concentration, but they are absorption, and there's an element of peace, an element of stillness there. Whatever pleasure those things contain, it lies in those moments of peace, those moments of certainty. Of course, the problem with those kinds of peace is that they don't last very long and they're very toxic because they can lead to all sorts of disturbance afterwards. This is why the Buddha said we have to search for the highest peace together with the highest happiness. They go together, and this is why the search for the highest happiness is not a selfish thing. The Buddha honors our desire for true happiness. Everywhere, he says, this path is for happiness, and we should take our desire for happiness seriously. It's not something we should be ashamed of. We don't have to say, well, I'll delay my own happiness and make other people happy first. That's not the Buddha's approach at all. He says that if you take your search for happiness seriously and find a happiness that really is reliable, it will take you to peace, to the highest peace where you are not harming anyone anywhere. And in the course of developing that happiness, we have to develop really honorable qualities of mind. There's the wisdom that sees that long-term happiness is better than short-term, and that it has to depend on your actions. That's why the question that lies at the beginning of wisdom or discernment is, what when I do it will lead to my long-term welfare and happiness? The wisdom lies in the long term, and it lies in the fact that you recognize you've got to do something for this happiness to come about. Then there's the compassion that comes as a corollary of that, which is you realize that if your peace is going to last, if your happiness is going to last, it has to depend on not causing any harm to anybody else. Otherwise, they'll try to destroy it. So you have to take their desire for peace, their desire for happiness into consideration. There's a passage where the Buddha tells King Pasenadi that you can search the whole world over, and you'll find no one who doesn't have fierce love for themselves. You have fierce love for yourself. Everyone else has the same fierce love for themselves. So if your happiness gets in the way of their fierce love of themselves, they're not going to stand for it. There'd be no peace. So you have to look for a happiness that doesn't depend on harming anybody and that requires purity in your actions, the purity of genuinely causing no harm. You have to look very carefully at your actions. What are you doing that could be causing harm to yourself, harm to other people? It's certainly not wise if you're doing that. And although there may be general instructions about which kinds of actions are harmful and which ones are not, there are a lot of little details that can't be put in books that you have to learn to observe for yourself. So you have to watch each action by watching your intention first, checking that out to see if it's an honorable intention, and then watching your action as you're doing it to see what immediate results it's producing. If it's producing harmful results, stop. If not, you can continue. After you're done, look at the long-term results. If you find out only afterwards that you've caused harm, then you have to make up your mind not to engage in that kind of action ever again, that kind of intention ever again. Then go talk it over with someone whose insight you trust. This is an important part of the Buddha's instruction on what we now call self-knowledge. For him, self-knowledge doesn't mean knowing yourself as a thing. It means knowing yourself in terms of actions. And he provides a context in which you can do this effectively. This is why he set up the monastic Sangha, so we'd have a group of people who are following the Buddha's teachings that anybody can come and consult with and say, I did this, and I got these results. What should I do? In other words, you don't have to reinvent the Dharma wheel every time you find you've made a mistake. You can tap into the knowledge and experience of people who are further along on the path. This is how we develop purity. As the Buddha told Rahula, all those in the past who purified their thoughts, words, and deeds did it in this way. All those in the future who are going to purify their thoughts, words, and deeds will do it this way. And all of those at present who are purifying their thoughts, words, and deeds do it this way. What this means is that if you take your search for happiness seriously, you have to develop wisdom, compassion, and purity, the virtues that are traditionally ascribed to the Buddha himself. This is part of his skill as a teacher, to show that if you take your happiness seriously, you have to develop good qualities of mind. It's not a purely hedonistic pursuit, nor are you simply learning how to indulge in pleasure in a sophisticated way. You realize that happiness is something important, and if it really is important, then you have to develop important qualities of mind. As we do this, we find that our actions become less and less harmful. There is less and less cause for conflict. On the one hand, that makes it easier for us to practice. On the other hand, it makes the world a better place to be in general, and in particular in terms of our thoughts. The world of our own mind becomes better too because, of course, our actions and words come out of our thoughts. This is where the Buddha finds the source of conflict to begin with. There's a sutta where Sakka, the king of the Devas, comes down to see the Buddha with some questions to ask him. It's an interesting sutta. It starts out with Sakka trying to get the Buddha in the right mood to talk with the Deva king. So he sends down one of his musicians. It's one of the nicer pieces of humor in the Pali Canon. The musician comes down. He sings a song about the Buddha, the Dharma, the Sangha, and lust. The song is directed to his lady love, telling her how he loves her as much as the arahants love the Dhamma, cataloging her body parts, the parts he loves as much as the arahants love the Dhamma. You can imagine the Buddha smiling to himself with the thought, this is a totally deluded little diva here. But at the end of the song, he compliments the diva on having written a song where the melody goes well with words, and the words go well with the melody. After all, the Buddha had been a prince, a connoisseur of music, so he would know. Then Sakka comes and asks the Buddha questions about conflict. I don't know if you know the story, but Indian mythology has a story very similar to one in Greek mythology. There's a story of how the Devas fought the Asuras for control of heaven and finally beat the Asuras, just as the Greek gods had to fight the Titans. And so Sakka, having had to wage war even when he was a Deva king, was very concerned about conflict. What are the roots of conflict? He asks. The Buddha traces them back, through acquisition, desire, all the way back to papanka or objectification, The type of thinking where you turn yourself into an object and then turn everybody else into an object. As an object or being, you need a place to stay in the world, a place to take the food that will keep you going as a being. So you have to stake out your territory in the world, whether it's physical territory, material territory, emotional territory, even your views. This leads to conflict. After all, as you move into the world, you run into other people, other beings who are involved in the project of objectifying themselves, and they may not like the role that you assign to them. There is conflict right there. Psychologists talk a lot about objectification, how we turn other people into objects, and the Buddha's insight was that we start out by turning ourselves into objects first. To stop the process, we first have to change the way we view ourselves. This is why the path to peace and calm, upasama, as they say in the suttas, starts with right view. Instead of looking at your experience in terms of yourself and other people or the world, that is, objects in the world, you look at things simply in terms of the Four Noble Truths, as stress, its cause, its cessation, and the path leading to its cessation, terms that don't refer to people at all. But each of these terms carries a skill. In the case of stress, you have to comprehend it, which means knowing it so thoroughly, seeing it so thoroughly, that you finally get dispassionate toward it. In the case of the origination of stress, you abandon it, which means not continuing to do it anymore. The cessation of stress is to be witnessed or verified, and the path is to be developed. Each of the Four Noble Truths has 3 levels of knowledge: knowing the truth, knowing the duty or skill appropriate to the truths, and then knowing that you've completed the duty, mastered the skill. 3 times 4 gives you 12 aspects of the knowledge of awakening, which is what the Dhamma wheel stands for. Back in India, when they combined sets of variables and list all the possible combinations, they would call it a wheel. So this is the Dhamma wheel. And it's interesting that the first sermon is the only place in the whole canon where the Buddha mentions this. It's his most important teaching. You'd think it would be all over the canon, but it's just in the context of this one talk. There are a few reflections on the topic in a few other places, but this is the only place where he sets it out clearly. But it's a teaching we have to keep in mind all the time. This is why he has us divide our experience into the 4 Noble Truths, so we can know what to do with whatever comes up. If we still think in terms of selves and the world, our duty is to stake out our part of the world that we claim for the self and then to defend it. But here he has us look at things in other terms, with other duties. For instance, with stress, if you think of yourself as a self, you don't like having the stress in yourself. You try to get rid of it, but getting rid of it is not the duty under the 4 truths. The duty is to comprehend it, to know it. That requires you to develop the path, with the mind in good strong concentration, mindful and alert, imbued with right effort, so you can develop the skill needed to comprehend stress. Because each of the tasks is actually a skill. This is why the path is a gradual path, because it takes a while to develop the skills. After all, Nibbana is very, very subtle. And even though it's immediately present, and the possibility of reaching it is theoretically available at any moment in time, our powers of perception are not up to it. Our skills are not skillful enough, not subtle enough. So we have to raise the subtlety of our mind as we develop these skills until finally we reach the level where we can have that sudden awakening into the ultimate peace. The image the Buddha gives is of the continental shelf off of India, a gradual slope out, and then, all of a sudden, a sharp drop. The reason the path has to be both gradual and sudden is because Nibbana is both present and subtle. So we have to gradually develop the subtlety of our mind so that we can then see, oh, it's right here. As the Buddha said, it's something you touch with your body, see with your body. The synesthesia there is interesting. There's no more division among the 6 senses. There's just an awareness that's outside of the 6 senses. but it's known right where you had your sense of the body. And that, he says, is the ultimate peace. It causes no harm to anyone. It's a dimension of no objectification at all. Even the question of what happens to you when you reach that doesn't occur anymore, because the you that you created as an object, or the world that you created as a place for objects, applies only as far as the six senses. The concept of there being nothing, no objects, also applies only as far as the six senses. When you move beyond the six senses, those concepts have no more meaning. But right now, we still live in the six senses. We're still objectifying. So sometimes the Buddha would answer in an objectifying way the kinds of questions he ordinarily would not answer, such as, what was I in the past? What am I going to be in the future? Ordinarily, he would put those questions aside. Yet there are occasional passages in the canon where he talks to people about what they were in the past. But he speaks in ways that are designed to give rise to the sense of dispassion that comes with comprehension. That is, you see that this really is a lot of suffering. Going through this process of samsara-ing is pretty miserable. You've probably heard the comparison of all the water in the oceans as being less than the tears you've shed. Well, there's a sutta where the comparison is even more dramatic. He says that all the blood you've lost by having your head cut off is greater than the water in the oceans. The water in the ocean is less than the tears you've shed, and it's less than the blood you've lost. He goes through all the different ways you might have lost blood by having your head cut off. For example, when you were a cow, the number of times you've been a cow and have your cow's head cut off. The amount of blood you've lost from just your cow lives is still greater than all the water in the oceans. The number of times you've been a sheep and had your sheep's head cut off, the blood you lost then is greater than all the water in the oceans. And so on through different beings, different kinds of animals. Then he goes into the times that you were a thief and had your head cut off, the times you were an adulterer or adulteress and had your head cut off. It's an awful lot of blood, and it's an awful lot of miserable existences. Just thinking about the fact that you've been equipped with a cow's head that many times, or a sheep's head that many times, is overwhelmingly dismaying. So he answers the question of what were you in a way that really does lead to dispassion, a comprehension of suffering. This is enough. The sutta states that all the monks who listened to that particular Dhamma talk all became arahants right away, because they saw that in objectifying yourself, these are the kinds of objects you come up with. You become a thief, you become a highway robber, you become an adulterer or adulteress, you become cows, sheep, goats, whatnot. There are constant opportunities to objectify yourself in really awful ways. There's constant conflict. The Buddha's insight is that if you learn how to stop objectifying yourself, then you don't turn other people into objects. You can live with them with a lot greater peace. And once you find the peace of Nibbana, you've found a happiness that doesn't require that anybody suffer at all. So this is where we find the ultimate happiness, because it's also the ultimate peace. It's a gift not only to ourselves, but also to everyone else, which is why this is such a good path to be on. There is some stress on this path. There are some difficulties in following this path. We haven't totally gotten to the place where we're not placing a burden on other people, and we have to make the effort to be as unburdensome as possible. The simple fact that we're here with a body that needs to be fed, clothed, sheltered, given medicine does place a weight on the world. So there's no real reason why we should want to come back, even if we have altruistic reasons, for it still imposes a weight, a burden on other people just to maintain this body. So a happiness that doesn't require that kind of weight or that kind of burden is a very precious thing. And the path leading to that happiness and the peace that comes with it is precious as well.